Matthew chapter 5, starting at verse 13. So this is what we're looking at today, being salt and light. Matthew 5:13. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Amen. And he says, I love it. I thought, well, that's nice. That's kind of a surprise. You don't know what silent witness even our building is. And who knows what people may think of each of us as light bearers. Hopefully, we have a positive influence and they can say they love being around us. But Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Can you picture Jesus as he said that? Maybe he had a little salt in his hands and he just sort of let it drop to the ground, tiny grains of salt. And he said to his followers, you are the salt of the earth. Or perhaps he just glanced up at the sun briefly and indicated to his listeners all around him the light that they were so indebted to. And he says, you are the light of the world. If you can imagine yourself in that crowd as Jesus spoke, and of course that was part of the Sermon on the Mount, I wonder what those words would mean to you. For to us today, salt and light are not always wholly positive. We know that basically salt and light are good, but especially with salt, we hear more about the dangers of it. Anyone that has high blood pressure knows that too much salt can be a contributory factor. So when we hear about salt, we may think, oh, well, I need to reduce my intake. Light gets a better press. But even there, when we think of our natural light source, the sun, we may also think, well, I better cover up and not get too much exposure because the ozone is depleted, lest I get skin cancer. So our perception of salt and light may not be exactly as it was to those that were listening to Jesus. Let's see what he actually said. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. What strikes me is that Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And I've put "are" in capitals to emphasize it. We are salt and light. Whether we feel like it, whether we're happy with that idea or not, is just simply a fact. That's what Jesus said, we are. It might be useful to think what salt and light meant back then. In ancient times, salt was seen as a necessity of life. Because of its seasoning and preservative qualities, it was one of the most highly prized minerals. In many societies, it was so highly valued that it was used for money. The English word salary is derived from the Latin word salarium, which refers to the payments made to a Roman soldier with salt. Just excuse me a second, I think this thing has frozen. In Bible times, and still today, salt is used for seasoning our food. Who likes to eat food without salt? Even though salt is so small and hardly noticeable, it makes a difference when applied to the substance. A couple of years ago, we ran a CHIP program, which is a complete health improvement program. And at the beginning, you had to go on a 5-day detox. And part of that, we had to cut out salt. And without salt, food is very bland. It was quite difficult to eat it. And as for light, well, for those in the first century, it would be even more valuable than it is perhaps for us today. They had no electricity. So apart from the sun's light, they had to rely... well, Richard was talking about a paraffin lamp, but they had oil lamps, which were similar. Palestinian homes were generally dark with just one window. And they did have a light, an oil lamp. But it was really hard to light it when it went out. They didn't have matches or cigarette lighters. So they would try to keep it alight all the time. But when they went out, it was a fire risk, so they would place an earthen vessel over it for safety. And as soon as they came home, they would take the earthen vessel off and placed it on its stand. So in Jesus' day, salt and light were seen as wholly positive. There was really none of the negative overtones that we have today. But what's it mean for us to be salt and light? And don't forget, this isn't an option for the Christian. Jesus said, you are salt and light. Well, it's basically about being an influence for good in the world. And some make a distinction between the application of the difference between salt and light. They say salt is more of a silent, quiet witness, and light has to do with more outward, visible effect. But they are both aspects that have been an influence. I doubt that Jesus had that particular distinction in mind. But let's think about what salt may mean for us. And again, just excuse me, I need to set this thing up a bit better. First of all, it means our faith is not just about us and God. Those of us that are British are most likely to have this tendency. In our culture, if you were born and bred in this country, you will know that religion is largely something private. It's up to the individual what they believe. We say, well, that's fine. They can believe whatever they want as long as they don't try and push it on me. That's very much the way we think. So for us, yes, our faith is important. And the bits we like best about our faith is praying alone, reading our Bibles, just us and God. Public worship is okay because we know we aren't offending anyone because everybody is a believer. But it starts to get difficult when we have to communicate our faith with a non-Christian, because our upbringing has warned us of the inappropriateness of that. Now, that may be the way we are, but Jesus challenges that attitude. By saying we are salt and light, Jesus is saying that our faith can never be about just us and God. It's also about us in the world. It's about us and other people. It's about letting our light shine and being an influence for good and for God in the world. Now, true, the way we interpret that will partly be determined by the culture that we're in, but we cannot deny this crucial aspect of our faith. It's also about our values. As a Christian seeking to live out the reality of being salt and light, it's partly about what you value most in life. Is it your house and property? Is it your looks, your leisure time, or is it the kingdom of God? Do you value yourself only, or do you value people and relationships with them? What's important to you? I think what Jesus is saying is that we are salt and light. He's saying that life is not just about us. It's not just about us and God. It's also about us and people. It's about our relationships with people and our influence upon them. Here are some practical examples that I came up with about what it means to be salt and light. First of all, I think it's about being bold and confident as a Christian. In the previous area where we were ministering, the ministers got together every so often, and on this one occasion, we went out to Jimmy's restaurant for lunch. And when we were there, one of the ministers had a very good relationship with the manager. And I was a bit surprised when we went in, and this manager went up immediately and hugged this particular minister. And he told us a story that when he'd been pastoring in a London area, this man, and he went around the local community, the shops, introducing himself as a local pastor. And this man, who was a restaurant of that particular Jimmy's in that part of London, said that he and his wife couldn't have their own children, and they would like prayer for that. So the minister arranged for this couple to come into their church, and the whole church prayed for them that they might have children. Now, I don't know the outcome of the story, whether they had children or not, but the point was that this couple was so happy that the church had shown interest in them, and that this man had struck up a really close friendship with the minister. So much so that every time he went in, he got a hug, and we got a discount off our meal, which was rather nice as well. But not everyone can go that, introducing themselves, as a pastor or as a Christian. But this guy was bold and confident, and he used the gifts that God had given him in an appropriate way. I think it's also about being unselfish. We have a friend where we live in Watford who is extremely giving of her time and means. And fairly regularly, she will just bring us round some food. And a couple of weeks ago, she just phoned up and said, "Would you like to come for lunch?" And it was really nice because we were busy. We hardly had time to cook a meal. And she isn't just like that with us because we're her friend. She will do that to her neighbours, and she's often stopping people in the street. And if she can give them something, she will. She's an extremely selfless person. I think that's part of what it means to be salt and light. It's also about sharing God. There are two extremes of the Christian faith. One is just saying too much to people and being insensitive. And the other is not saying enough. I think we've all come in contact with a religious person that talks too much. Becky Pippert tells a story of witnessing to one of her fellow students in California. They were talking about whether they believed in God. And Becky began telling her friend that she did believe in God. And at first her friend seemed to be listening. But as Becky became more enthusiastic about what her faith meant to her, she saw that her friend was kind of withdrawing emotionally. Still, Becky carried on, just not knowing what else to do because she was sort of on a roll. So she was sort of having a private conversation with herself about Christ and trying to figure out how to stop. Suddenly she realized how ridiculous it was, and she said, "Look, I feel really bad. I'm very excited about what God has done in my life. But I hate it when people push religion on me. So if I'm coming on too strong to you, just tell me." And the friend said, "I can't believe that you said that." "Why?" Becky answered. "Well, I never knew that Christians were aware that we who are not Christians hate being on the receiving end of a monologue." "Listen," Becky responded, "most Christians I know are very hesitant to share their faith, precisely because they're frightened they will offend. But her friend said, but as long as you let people know you're aware where they're coming from, you can say anything you want. I think most Christians fall into that category of not sharing because we're too well aware that people may not want to listen. But what this story tells us is people may want to hear, but what we can do is just check out with them. Is it okay if I continue sharing? Just be honest with the person. Ask them if they want to know. I think being salt and light is also about mingling. To be effective, we need to be among people. Now, as Adventists, we always have a tendency to separate ourselves from people. That's an almost inevitable result of our lifestyle, because we don't drink, we don't do clubs, the kind of social things that many people do. But I certainly believe in our principles on temperance, but it's a tragedy if it means we don't meet people socially. I think we really should be trying even harder to socialise because of that particular barrier. I can think of one Adventist lady in London who's done this. She was trained as a lawyer, and she's put her skills to good use by being really involved in her local community. She's been on committees to do with race relations, young people's issues, housing, etc. She knows so many people in her local council because of the networking that she's done. And much of it has been voluntary. Many of the counsellors and people she worked with knows that she's a Christian and an Adventist. She knows she is salt and light, and she seeks to live that out. I think it's also to be different. We are to be different, not just in word, not just people that go to church once a week, not a group that just keep the Sabbath day as special. As well as those things, we are to be different. Our values are derived not from the world or our friends or our families, but from our relationship with Jesus Christ. Who and what we are is fundamentally determined by the fact that we're Christian and Adventist. We are to be different. And when I say that, some of you may be thinking, well, it's about what we wear. Yes, it will probably include that. Some of you may be thinking, well, it means I don't drink alcohol and that my health is important. Yes, that's part of it. But it's more than those things. It starts with what is inside us, the change that God is making in us. And then it becomes manifest in those things. Probably more important than them is really our characters. Being salt and light isn't really about what you look like. It's not just about what you do, although that's getting closer to it. Being salt and light is about having a positive influence on people. It's about having a pleasant, helpful character, someone you want to be around. I can think of one Adventist man who's very much like that. He's over 80 years old, and he's a real joy to meet. He's the kind of guy that will do anything for anyone. He's been a cabinet maker and carpenter most of his life. He's extremely good with his hands, and he's happy to use his skills to help people. In Watford Town Church, he and I worked on the roof of the new church building. And all the time, he was positive, joking. It's just a pleasure to work with. And he will do anything practical for the church. And he's very helpful with his neighbours. I consider him to be different. He genuinely loves God and loves people. His religion goes deep and is very practical. I think it's also about being honest. Being salt and light doesn't necessarily mean that we're perfect, but it should mean that we are honest about our imperfections. People hate a hypocrite. In your actions, yes, you should be different from your friends, but in some ways, you may not. But one difference there should be is that you're open about your flaws. It's hard to imagine Jesus being comfortable with Christians that try to hide their faults and pretend they are something they're not. So if you said something to hurt someone at work or at college or at home, as a Christian, having gone away and reflected upon it, you'll be able to go and apologize. Being salt and light doesn't necessarily mean we always get it right. What it should mean is that instead of covering it up, we have the emotional and spiritual maturity to deal with it and to seek to put it right. Jesus seemed to emphasize in this passage that we don't live it as we might. Even though he said, "You are salt and light," he immediately goes on to explain how we may not live it out. Look at this passage again, and I'll put the words in yellow, which are about not doing it. And certainly in that first statement, nearly all of it is about not doing it. Less in the second one, but there's still quite a bit. Very real possibility that we won't be doing it as we should. So it mentions that salt can lose its saltiness and a light can be hidden. That's strongly said, and it's probably our situation. Have we lost it? Well, to some extent, we probably have. Are you and I salty? Is the atmosphere around us light or dark? There was a late teen in one church where I pastored. She was part of the worship team and she sang really nicely. However, she went to a local college, and there was one young man who came to our church and went to the same college. He had recently come into the faith and he was very sincere in his beliefs. And he told me that this girl was one thing at church and another thing at college. She wasn't being an influence for good outside of church. Some of us may be like that. We're one thing in church, but we're something quite different out there. Others of us don't share for various reasons. We value our friendships too much, or we're too self-centered. Whatever it is, Jesus emphasizes that our saltiness and light shining must not be compromised. How then can we be salt and light? If we feel we're inadequate, what can be done? Well, I've only really one suggestion, and that is spend time with God. I wonder if you value getting your information from the internet, the newspaper, the TV news, or do you like to reflect on what God is saying in the Bible? Not that there's anything wrong with the media. Of course, we need to know what's going on. How would we know about the world around us if we didn't have the news media? Of course, we need it. But do we value the information sources around us so much that there's no time or interest to listen to what God has to say? Commenting on this passage on salt and light and the way we should be practically helping people by bringing hope, by being cheerful around them, by encouraging them, Ellen White talks about the source of it all. No man can impart that which he himself has not received. It is the love of God continually transferred to man that enables him to impart light. If all were willing to receive, all would become filled with the Spirit. We are salt and light. That's a huge responsibility to live out. And it can only be fulfilled if we're each willing to approach God to receive from him. And the more you feel the desire to be salt and light, the more you need to spend time with God in order to be equipped to do so. In conclusion, I'm going to read the words of Jesus again. And this time, I'm going to insert my name. Perhaps you would like to insert yours. I, Jonathan, am the salt of the earth. But if my salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. I, Jonathan, am the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, I will let my light shine before others, that they may see my good deeds and glorify my Father in heaven. I love this idea of being salt and light. I want to live it out. Don't you? Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Jonathan, for reminding us of what